because all my life I had believed in Malaysia, in merger.
Today, this is a modern city. 10 years from now, this will be a metropolis.
Singapore is smaller than New York City. It has no oil, no water, no farmland. In 1965, the British walked away and predicted it would collapse. Today, the average Singaporean is richer than the average Brit. The colony beat the empire. Here are the numbers. As of 2024, GDP per capita in Singapore is roughly $84,000. In the United Kingdom, the country that ruled Singapore for 146 years, GDP per capita is around $49,000. Measured by purchasing power, the gap is bigger. The average Singaporean now produces and earns more than twice as much as the average Briton on that measure. The island has 5.9 million people. The UK has 67 million. Singapore covers 734 square kilometers of land. The UK has 244,000, over 330 times more. By every traditional metric, this is not supposed to happen. Empires do not lose to their former colonies. Big rich countries do not lose to tiny resourceless ones. But Singapore did beat the United Kingdom, not by accident, by design. And it is the cleanest example on Earth of one rule: geography decides money. But only if the people on top of the geography play it right. This is the story of how a swamp became a country, and a country became a financial superpower. Start with 1819. A British East India Company official named Stamford Raffles sailed into the Johor Strait and signed a treaty with the local Malay Sultanate that gave Britain a trading post on the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. Raffles immediately understood what he had. He stood on the choke point, the narrow strip of sea between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca. Every ship sailing east from Europe to China, every spice ship, every tea ship, every opium ship had to thread that needle. Raffles built his trading post right at the squeeze. For the next 146 years, the British ran Singapore as a colonial port. The population grew from a few thousand fishermen and traders to nearly 2 million people by independence. Chinese workers, Indian laborers, Malay locals, Europeans, everyone funneled in to work the docks, the warehouses, the rubber yards. Singapore was profitable for London, painfully profitable. And then came the war. In February 1942, Singapore fell to Japan in 7 days. It was the largest surrender in British military history. More than 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops captured by a smaller Japanese force. The myth of British invincibility in Asia ended on that island. After the war, the British returned, but everyone knew the empire was finished. By 1963, Singapore had merged with Malaysia. 2 years later, in 1965, Malaysia kicked Singapore out. That is where the modern story begins. On August 9, 1965, Singapore's Prime Minister Kuan Yew went on television and cried on live broadcast.
I had believed in Malaysia, in merger.
He told his country they had been ejected from a larger nation, that they had no military, no industry, no natural resources, no fresh water. Singapore still imports most of its drinking water from Malaysia today, and that he had no idea how the country would survive. International observers agreed. The Wall Street Journal, the British press, regional analysts all wrote variations of the same prediction. Singapore would collapse inside a decade. Kuan Yew was not your average independence leader. He was Cambridge-educated, a brilliant lawyer, an absolute pragmatist. He spoke English, Mandarin, Malay, and some Tamil. He had no patience for ideology. When communism rose across Asia, he crushed it locally. When socialism stalled European economies, he ignored it. When the West pushed Singapore to liberalize democracy faster, he refused. He ran the country with a tightly disciplined one-party system that critics called soft authoritarianism. Whatever you call it, the results are on the scoreboard. Singapore did not collapse. Kuan Yew picked up the geography that the British had left behind and turned it into a machine. Step 1 was the port. Singapore sits on the Strait of Malacca, and the Strait of Malacca handles roughly 25% of all goods traded by sea on Earth. Every container ship from China to Europe passes within a few miles of the island. Kuan Yew told his planners to build the biggest, fastest, most efficient port humanly possible. Today, the Port of Singapore is the busiest transshipment port in the world. More than 130,000 ships pass through every year. If a container is moving across half the planet, there is a high chance it spends a few hours in Singapore. Step 2 was a calculated bet on multinational corporations. Most newly independent countries in the 1960s did the opposite of what Singapore did. They kicked out foreign companies, nationalized industries, raised tariffs, tried to build their own factories. Kuan Yew rolled out the red carpet for the Americans, the Japanese, the British, the Dutch. Cheap labor, stable laws, English-speaking workforce, tax holidays. Singapore turned itself into the easiest country in the world to set up a factory or a regional headquarters. Step 3 was housing. In 1960, more than 70% of Singaporeans lived in slums or rooftop shanties. The government created the Housing and Development Board, the HDB. Over the next few decades, HDB built blocks of high-rise public housing across the country. Today, around 80% of Singaporeans live in HDB flats. Most of them own their flat outright. The country has one of the highest home ownership rates on earth. Public housing is not poverty housing in Singapore. It is the default for the middle class. Step 4 was education. Singapore spends massively on its schools. The country consistently ranks number 1 or number 2 in the world on the OECD's PISA tests, the international rankings for math, science, and reading among 15-year-olds. The British system tends to land in the middle of the OECD. The country that taught Singapore how to read in English has been outscored by Singapore on reading tests in English for years now. Step 5 was anti-corruption. Kuan Yew came to power with a near obsession about corruption. He paid his ministers extremely well, on the theory that you cannot buy a minister who already earns $1 million a year legally. And he gave the anti-corruption agency the power to investigate anyone, including the Prime Minister himself. Today, Singapore is consistently ranked among the 5 least corrupt countries on Earth by Transparency International. Most former colonies look nothing like this. Step 6 was money management. Singapore did not just earn revenue, it invested it. The country built 3 giant sovereign wealth funds. Temasek Holdings, founded in 1974, manages government-owned companies and stakes, currently around $400 billion in assets. GIC, the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation, founded in 1981, manages Singapore's foreign reserves and is estimated to handle over $700 billion. Plus, the central bank's own reserves. Combined, Singapore controls well over $1.5 trillion of investable assets. For a country of less than 6 million people, the math works out to over $250,000 of sovereign wealth per citizen. In the British system, it works out to almost nothing. The UK does not have a meaningful sovereign wealth fund. And the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the country's central bank, does something almost no other central bank on Earth does. It manages the economy by adjusting the value of the Singapore dollar against a basket of currencies, instead of by changing interest rates. It is an unusual setup that demands extreme discipline. Singapore runs it without breaking a sweat. Now the contrast. Because while Singapore was building, Britain was unwinding. The British Empire was the largest in human history at its peak, over a quarter of the world's land and people at the start of the 20th century. Both world wars wrecked the British treasury. The pound stopped being the world's reserve currency. The dollar took over. The colonies declared independence one after another in the 1950s and 60s. By the 1970s, Britain was in serious decline. Strikes paralyzed the country. Inflation hit the double digits. In 1976, the United Kingdom, once the world's largest economy, had to ask the International Monetary Fund for a $3.9 billion bailout. The most powerful empire in modern history was being lent money by the same kind of institution Britain had helped design at Bretton Woods. Margaret Thatcher privatized industries through the 1980s, and the country recovered. Financial services in London exploded. But Britain never solved the underlying problem. Productivity growth has been stagnant for years. By some estimates, real wages have barely moved since 2008. Manufacturing has shrunk from over a quarter of the economy to less than a tenth. The 2016 Brexit vote and the years of trade friction that followed slowed growth further. By 2024, GDP per capita in the UK had been overtaken by Singapore, by Switzerland, by Ireland, by Norway. The empire became the patient. London is still one of the great financial capitals of the planet, but outside of London, the picture is much harder. Regional cities like Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle have median incomes that lag southern England by huge margins. The British economy concentrated wealth in one city and let the rest hollow out. Singapore did not have that option. It is one city. So what made the difference? The easy answer is geography. Singapore sits on the most important shipping lane in the world. That is true, but geography alone does not explain it. Malaysia is right next to the same shipping lane. Indonesia is next to the same shipping lane. Both have far more land, more resources, more people. Neither matches Singapore's wealth. Geography handed Singapore a winning ticket. It took political choices to cash it in. The real answer is the combination: geography plus institutions, Strait of Malacca plus rule of law, trading post plus anti-corruption agency, free port plus sovereign wealth fund, English language inherited from the British, plus a culture of saving and investing that the British themselves had stopped practicing. Singapore took everything useful Britain left behind, fixed everything Britain had been doing wrong, and ran the whole experiment with a population the size of Scotland. This is the resource curse in reverse. The country with nothing in the ground built more wealth per person than the country that once owned a quarter of the planet. If you ever doubted that geography decides money, but only if the people on the geography play it right, Singapore is the proof. Smaller than New York, richer per person than Britain, a pinprick on the map that runs the most profitable shipping route on Earth. The colony beat the empire, because the colony understood what the empire forgot. Geography is the starting line, institutions are the race. Geography decides money, geography decides power, and sometimes, when you play it right, geography decides who beats the empire.